Hello students, I want to give you a worksheet that will help you in addressing your fieldwork assignments. And so there'll be 4 fieldwork assignments you're going to do this semester. One thing that this sheet is designed to help you do is to increase your skills of observation. And so a lot of times we show up and we see things, we take images in, and if we don't have boxes to put those images and sounds and symbols and everything else in, a lot of times it kind of just washes all together into one thing. And so I have this document for you in the course called Signal Systems, and we're going to talk through the signal systems. So when you think of communication, you probably think of verbal and or written communication, but communication specialists tell us this is a relatively insignificant part of the total communication picture of messages that we take in and we receive every day. And so we're going to go through some other categories that maybe you haven't thought about. The first of these is verbal. Sometimes we use the same word for a particular word, but we have different definitions. And so we're not just talking about what are the categories for various forms of communication. We're also talking about how do people from 2 different backgrounds, cross-culturally or cross-linguistically, even cross-generation or cross-gender, all of these things can be misunderstood. And so as we're learning to think in terms of communication and cross-cultural communication and observation, we want to make sure that we don't just assume our definition is the definition. You can probably think of several words in today's language that mean something radically different than it meant a generation ago. Let's take the word gay. We have this Christmas song about being happy and gay. It does not mean at all what it means in today's world. And so even people today might feel a little bit awkward singing that song just because they're thinking of the new connotation for that word. So there's verbal. We think of spoken language. Typically, we think of it first when we think of communication. I would say secondarily, we probably think of the written word. So people interact with the written word very differently. For some people, they might read words but not know them because they are not aware that they're hearing words. And so this is how we would define an oral culture. People have never actually really read a word. Even if their eyes have come across the words, it just looks like lines and scratches to them. And so even for us, we always assume the standpoint of literacy in our discipleship, in our training, in our education model. But growing generations within our own country and then obviously around the world, people even approach something like the written word differently. Some cultures use an alphabet like ours. Other cultures use more of a pictograph type symbol for their letters or for their words. And so even amongst written word, you're going to notice some differences. And so as you do, for instance, your neighborhood walk through, or maybe as you visit a place of worship from a different religion, from your various field works, you're going to notice their characters are very different from ours. Numbers communicate things. If I say the number 666, an immediate idea pops in all of our minds as Christians. If I say lucky number, your mind filled that in with 7. If I said Friday you would think 13th. In fact, in many of our tall skyscrapers, they don't have a 13th floor button. It goes from 12 to 14. But is this universal? Do all peoples in all languages, times, cultures, etc. understand that 13 is the unlucky number? The answer is no. In China, the unlucky number is 4. There's a bank not too far from where I live here in Chinatown, and they don't have a 4th floor button. It goes from 3 to 5. There's pictorial communication, images that we receive. This is probably a pretty common one for us. Studies show that younger generations, when they watch television or animated films or whatever, that they're able to pick up such smaller nuances in terms of how things are shaded or colored or which way things are moving than older generations are. There are things like audio. As you walk about, you hear things. Our cities tend to be a little bit quieter, but there's still certain sounds that we hear that maybe you don't think about. When I lived in the Middle East, in that city, you'd be walking down the street and someone would go, psst, 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 psst. And this was their way, if you're ever in a park biking or walking and you hear someone shout on your left, that's our way of warning you. But over there, that psst, psst, psst That's the very polite and indirect way of letting you know that they're coming up behind you. Constant honking everywhere. If you're going to turn, you honk. If you're going to stop, you honk. If you go, you honk. Constant honking everywhere you go. So there were all of these audio cues as to where you were and what was happening. Different people that would come down the street, each had their own sound that they would make on something. And so, streets away, you could tell who was coming to your street and selling what based on memorizing those sounds. There are things like artifacts, clothing, objects, brands. So you can kind of tell who's doing what based on how they're dressed. Somebody wearing a white lab coat we associate with being a doctor or some kind of scientist. Someone in athletic shorts we associate with sports. And so clothes can be important as well. If you go to a mosque, you'll notice everyone is dressed in a particular way. And maybe if you aren't dressed appropriately when you go, please dress appropriately. But if you're not, you might be given something to put on over to make you appropriate. And so these kinds of cues help us understand when we're changing from one space to another. There are things like kinesic forms of communication, gestures, smiles, facial expressions that people will make. And so every now and then you might see in our culture or in other cultures, like people will kind of tap their nose, and it has a certain meaning. And some of the bus stops in the city where I lived in the Middle East, you'd see people, that many buses would service this one stop, and instead of having signs on the buses, the drivers would make a symbol. And so they would do something like this, or you'd see people on the street standing there making the symbol to buses as they pass by, trying to find which was their bus. There are things that are optical, things like light, color, when to use what color. Sometimes this goes back also to written word. Written words have their obvious stated meaning, but then they have much, much, much deeper meanings. So take the word red, for instance. Red typically just means the color red. Or politically, it could mean communist. Or politically, it could mean Republican, depending on whether we're talking nationally or globally. But we could talk about he is red, which means he's angry. He's red. He's red in the face. We could talk about a red letter day. We talk about a black day, black sheep, green with envy. I'm feeling blue. He's a yellow-bellied coward. For us, each of these colors have meaning, an agreed-upon meaning, because we're all in the same culture, perhaps. And so it's important to recognize these colors change. If you go to a mosque, you'll notice typically the floor and the carpet is green. Why is it green? Well, it's green because that's the color of paradise. Why is it the color of paradise? Well, when you live in the desert, anything green looks like paradise. And so colors have meaning, but where for us it means envy, for them it means something very, very, very different. There's tactile communication. These are things like interpersonal touch. Who touches who, how and when. This could relate to things such as greetings. Do men and women shake hands? Do only the men shake hands? Do they kiss each other? Do you kiss everyone? Do you give like that old style Southern kiss to the ladies? Do you completely avoid ever touching women? Do you give a kiss on each cheek to people of your same gender? All of these things change from culture to culture, but when you start noticing them, you'll start seeing who is doing what. We were observing a Japanese dinner party one night at a mall, and it was interesting to just kind of people watch with this structure in mind and go, okay, who is sitting where? Who is standing where? Who speaks to who? In what order? And there was a very clear pattern that they were following. And I don't think that I understood all of it. I would definitely need to ask more questions. But I did notice they were doing things differently than I would do things. And that's one of those cultural differences. There are things like spatial differences. How close do people stand to each other? It's always funny to see at some kind of international fellowship some Westerner being backed into the corner because their personal space is being invaded and they're backing further and further up, whereas the person who's backing them into the corner is just trying to have a close, intimate conversation. But we've all probably had our space, whatever your level, whether it's near or far, we've all probably had our space invaded a little bit too closely. How close are houses? How close should we drive to each other when we're on the street? What counts as tailgating? My wife has one definition. I have a very different definition. Temporal communication. How do people think about time? This doesn't just relate to what does an hour mean, or but it also relates to things like time in relationships. When I come to your house and I stop for a visit, how long is too long? How long is the right amount of time? And so these vary from culture to culture. Time also relates to being present-oriented, past-oriented, or future-oriented. And again, culture to culture, these things are different. How do you measure time? Do you use generalizations? Do you use specificity? I was in Papua New Guinea on a trip, and they talked about, I will see you at noontime. Noontime for them, they don't wear watches. Noontime meant any time when the sun is from here in the sky to there in the sky. And so it's a very broad range of time. Basically, it means daylight hours. And finally, kind of a fancy word, olfactory. Olfactory is smell and taste. This relates to things like food, drinks, scents, what foods are eaten at what time of year. So you can always tell when it's holiday time in some culture because special smells, special foods start coming out. And honestly, those smells unlock all of these happy memories. Think of your favorite Christmas food, your favorite Thanksgiving food. You know, the moment you start smelling stuffing or green bean casserole or sweet potato casserole or something like that, all of a sudden it brings back all these warm memories and your mouth starts watering. Other people's cultures might not do the same for you. When we were in the Middle East, there was this festival they had. Basically translated, it's called the Smelly Festival. They take these dried fish, and they're everywhere in the city. We were in a relatively large city, millions and millions of people. And the whole city stinks for 3 days. And they go on and on. It's not bad fish. I had it. Very strong. Probably not everybody's fare. But, it did not unlock that sense of nostalgia for me, even though I was happy to try it and to enjoy it. So I want you to take, I've given you a chart here, and it has each of these categories that I've just listed on the chart. And so as you go, you maybe don't need to take the paper in hand, although it might be helpful, I don't know. Perhaps not at the religious service, but especially the neighborhood walk around. Take it maybe in hand and think through these different categories. Don't just walk and think about, you saw a person or you saw a Chevy or you saw a house or whatever. But you start noticing things in a neighborhood. There are particular neighborhoods. You might see a certain kind of flag in the yard, and that might symbolize something. It could be a rainbow flag. It could be an American flag. It could be, for us here in Texas, a Texas flag. Certain places in the South, you might see a Confederate flag. Sometimes you might see military flags in someone's yard. And so something as simple as that. I can walk through neighborhoods in Houston, and I can spot where Vietnamese people live. I know that sounds a little creepy, but there's a particular style of plant that older Vietnamese people in particular love to plant in their yard. And you can be driving down a street and just see one all the way down the street, and it's just very, very clear. They prefer a certain type of lawn foliage and decoration and everything else. And so don't just walk through the neighborhood and see houses. Really take deeper observation. If you walk through the neighborhood and you look at cars and you see bumper stickers in other languages, that might be a cue that this neighborhood might be a little bit more diverse than you thought it was. Or it might have a people that you didn't know that it had. I was walking through a neighborhood in Houston and all of a sudden noticed all the bumper stickers switched to Arabic. And all of the window hangings and the stickers and everything else switched to Quranic verses. And I realized, wow, we have this one little neighborhood. We have many other neighborhoods with lots of Muslims, but this one in particular is this little pocket where all of these Muslims live. And I didn't know it. It wasn't in a part of town that you would have expected that. And then not too long after that, you saw a fairly large mosque popping up. So it got a little more obvious, but the cues were there all along for people who were watching. So I would say there's three practical applications for this tool. One, it's a research tool. You can use this as a grid for analyzing any culture. You can use it for analyzing your own church, which is number two, a worship tool. Are the things that you're trying to communicate through the light, the sound, what people wear, the order of the service, are they being communicated or not? How could they be being miscommunicated to someone that's not from your cultural background. If you saw someone that was from a radically different background, is there something you do in your service that would seem odd to them? And then finally, this is a communication tool. It's hard to learn another language, but there are times when, even going cross culturally, even when you don't know the language, you can look and sound like an insider, and people can feel quite at home with you, because even though you don't have the verbal skills, the rate at the time you would spend in meeting, the way in which you shake their hand or greet them or give them a kiss or whatever the standard greeting is, how you might sit on the floor, sit on a chair, take your shoes off, leave your shoes on, all of these different kind of very subliminal cues that show that you know what you're doing or that you belong can really go the extra mile in helping build that friendship. So take this tool with you and use this as you go do your field work.